Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we learn of the service of a Canadian soldier, a helicopter incident which led to the invention of new safety equipment, and a shovel with a thrilling nautical history. Jennifer looks at a shovel whose history celebrates the camaraderie and cleverness of submariners.
It's fun letting them know some of the stuff we can talk about. We did have some fun. Some of it was crazy. Some of it might have been considered illegal, but we did it anyway.
Mark looks at a barker bar that provided safety to the crew of Canadian Sea King helicopters.
So engineers, when they're designing aircraft or any other machinery, can't and don't think of everything. And oftentimes, one of the most important things they neglect is a safety item.
Mark looks at a memorial cross awarded to a decorated Canadian soldier.
While he has always been a name that has been mentioned in the family, and I always knew that he was someone that perished during the First World War, I now have a much greater appreciation for his service and for what he did for his king and country. My name is Sandy Hiltz, and I am a second-year commerce student at St. Mary's University. Today I brought in a collection of paper materials, including telegraphs and letters, as well as a memorial cross awarded to the mother of the late Aubrey Grant, my great-great-uncle, who died during the First World War.
Established in the wake of the Great War's devastation, the Memorial Cross has been issued to the families of Canada's fallen servicemen and women for over a century, symbolizing deep gratitude and recognition of their profound sacrifice. Over the years, the sterling silver cross has undergone several modifications, from changing royal ciphers to styling alterations where, in 1945, it went from being worn around the neck to being fixed by a silver brooch bar. Perhaps the most significant shift was implemented in 2007, when an intense re-evaluation of its criteria resulted in an expansion of eligibility. Now, all service-related deaths are recognized in Canada, with medals distributed to upwards of 3 individuals personally identified by the recipient, better reflecting the needs of today's modern families.
Well, I'd like to welcome Sandy to the show, and we've brought an interesting item that has a connection to your family.
That's right, Mark. Today I've brought in a memorial cross, which was awarded to the mother of my great-great-uncle, Aubrey Grant.
So this medal is basically what we know today as a Silver Cross medal.
Exactly. So it was awarded to Aubrey's mother, my great-great-grandmother, following the end of the First World War. Aubrey died in 1918, and it was sent to her following his death.
And it's remained in the family since then?
Yes, exactly. It's come down through the family with quite an extensive archive of papers and photographs relating to Aubrey's wartime service.
The artifact today was a medal, which seems insignificant, but it tells a significant story of another fallen soldier of the First World War and his direct connection to the family that still has his information with him today. So, Aubrey Grant, what do we know of his wartime service? Obviously, he's a casualty from the First World War. What do we know and what happened? We
know that he was awarded the 1914-15 Star, so he went over quite early in the war, and then eventually was wounded and died in 1918. He received a gunshot wound to the left arm and shoulder, and then he spent a number of weeks in the 33rd Casualty Clearing Station in France, where he succumbed to his injuries on the 3rd of September.
And in that documentation that you have, there's actually a letter from one of the sisters at that casualty clearing station.
There's letters from nursing sisters, chaplains, and a couple of senior officers relating to his condition. And I can't imagine that that was done for everyone, given the great number of casualties during the war.
And at that particular point, again, we're at the end, September 1918, the amount of fighting and the amount of offensive operations between the British and the Germans at that point was very extensive.
Oh, exactly, yes. And there would have been a phenomenal amount of casualties at that time. So it's interesting to see how much attention was paid to him and how much communication there was back and forth about Aubrey's condition. I think it would be really interesting to know why that was. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen, but it would be fascinating to know.
So Aubrey Grant's war was full of action. He was actually decorated prior to him being killed.
Yes, that's right. He was awarded the Military Medal in either late 1916, early 1917, and that was for one of those acts that is really one of those great stories to come out of the wars. You know, he was the sole line of communication between the commanding officer and a trench that they had taken further up. And he made 6 or 7 crossings with no cover of any sort under heavy shell fire to bring the orders to these men that were forward of the commanding officer under, you know, really unbelievable conditions. You can imagine what it would have been like to have those shells exploding around you and so on. It's really unimaginable.
And obviously there's we can see the grainy footage today of the shell pock-marked French landscape. I mean, that's obviously the way that it was, just nothing except for mud and trenches basically at that point.
Exactly, and I'm sure that's exactly what he would have been seeing and experiencing as he was going to that trench further up. And it's really horrific to imagine what those conditions would have been like.
Aubrey Grant lies in a cemetery in Ligny-Saint-Fauchel, which is near the Pas de Calais in France, and is a testament to the service and the sacrifice of a small family from New Glasgow. Thank you, Sandy, for sharing part of your family's history here today. Obviously, a decorated soldier and a casualty of the First World War is something of amazing interest even 100 years after it's happening. And he is, you know, obviously there's an extensive documentation you have with your family and the information that was sent back and forth. And it's amazing that it survived over the 100+ years.
Well, I think that this has been an interesting opportunity to delve back into those archives and really take a look at them. You know, sometimes when you have things around the house like that, they tend to be sort of forgotten and stuck away in drawers. But it's an interesting opportunity to have looked back at them and to really have delved quite deeply into Aubrey's story and understand just what went on during the war, and to really take a look at the bravery that should be remembered.
The archive and medal we saw today represents the first military cross that was given to mothers of fallen soldiers. And today that Silver Cross medal is used even today from wars in Afghanistan where Canada has lost troops. Silver Cross medals have been awarded since then. And it represents the sacrifice that the mothers were giving to let their sons go to war. And this has been, obviously, it's a direct link with that practice that still goes on today.
Well, this was a wonderful opportunity personally in that it encouraged me to go and look through these papers and give them a read over, which I had not properly done before, and gain a more thorough understanding of Aubrey's wartime service and valor. So while he has always been a name that has been mentioned in the family, and I always knew that he was someone that perished during the First World War, I now have a much greater appreciation for his service and for what he did for his king and country.
Coming up on Militaria.
The Barker Bar represents a unique piece of Canadian military history. It's a safety item, but it came about from an incident that almost cost the life of a crew member.
Peter J. Robichaud. I brought in a Barker Bar from the Shearwater Aviation Museum's collection.
Whether directly affiliated with the military or not, most Canadians are familiar with its Navy's Sea King helicopters. Acquired in 1963, the anti-submarine warfare helicopters were compact enough to fit on ships of varying sizes. From destroyers and frigates, the nearly 9-ton Sea Kings could lift off, survey for enemy threats, and land safely and swiftly on even the smallest carriers prone to heavy sea pitch and roll. For over 50 years, the Sea King service extended far beyond the military, participating in disaster relief, search and rescue, and pollution and fisheries patrols, among other domestic operations. On December 1st, 2018, the aging maritime helicopters were bittersweetly retired. But the Sea King's legacy as the Canadian Armed Forces' longest-serving aircraft still holds strong today.
I'd like to welcome Peter J. Robichaud back from the Shearwater Aviation Museum, and we've got another interesting item from the collection that we're able to showcase today.
That's right, Mark. This rather simple-looking striped bar turns out to be a pretty critical life-saving piece of equipment. 1970, a crew was conducting a search and rescue mission off the coast of Nova Scotia here. At some point, one of these crewmen got up to presumably look out one of the viewports or windows of the aircraft to look for the incidents, and accidentally hit the latch, which is the main access door just behind the pilot, and was ejected from the aircraft, which was flying roughly 100 feet off the surface and around 145 knots, so around 270 kilometers an hour, 165 miles an hour. And the crewman managed to muckle on to components of the exterior of the aircraft. Meanwhile, several other crew members from the Sea King managed to scramble and get this person back into the aircraft, and they carried on with the mission. But this necessitated a safety feature, you could say, you could call this, and it became known as the Barker Bar in honor of the crewman who was accidentally ejected from the aircraft.
The Barker Bar represents a unique piece of Canadian military history for lots of reasons. It's a safety item, which ultimately provided protection for the crews on the Sea King, but it came about from an incident that almost cost the life of a crew member. And he was part of the crew, but his legacy is that he's not remembered. He's actually, an item is named after him, which in that sense is part of the Air Force's history and the Canadian Navy's history, and it goes on from there.
Right, it's a very interesting way to live on in infamy, so to speak. But it also is an illustration how one person or one person's incident in this case can affect an entire process of change and a safety item implemented in the end result. So engineers, when they're designing aircraft or any other machinery, can't and don't think of everything. And oftentimes, one of the most important things they neglect is a safety item. And sometimes that safety item is discovered via tragic circumstances, or in this case, a rather amusing circumstance. And thankfully, that was the case here. An amusing circumstance which resulted in a very important piece of safety equipment.
So for 50 years, the Sea King was flying over Nova Scotian skies, and of course, they were used by the Royal Canadian Navy as their anti-submarine helicopter on the back of various frigates throughout the course of the 50 years. The initial use for the Sea King in 1963 was actually on the Bonaventure, Canada's last aircraft carrier, and they were introduced into service in the course of that time. But over the 50 years, there's a tremendous amount of history behind operationally what the Sea King has done, both on this coast and also, of course, on the west coast with the west part of the Navy, and everywhere across the world where Royal Canadian Navy ships have carried a Sea King on them.
In later years, it also became involved in fisheries patrols off the coast of Nova Scotia and making sure that there was no nefarious activity out in our coastal waters. And these activities weren't a task per se, like sometimes they would just be generally an observation while conducting some normal training flying. Even things such as oil slicks they would have seen in the water, that would be noted and reported. The Sea King provided valuable, extremely valuable information, as it was an autonomous information collection platform that can clearly detach from the ship and go out beyond to where the ship's sensors can sense things and collect information. And what's done with that information? Someone like myself in an intelligence department would handle that information and feed it through a process and then eventually turn it into intelligence. The Sea King provided incredible service to the Canadian military throughout its nearly 60-year life cycle, due to the fact that we have incredibly skilled technicians. Not just the operators obviously operate the equipment, but someone has to maintain and keep that equipment flying. And if you can imagine all those millions of parts all moving together in close formation, as they like to say, in the sky, that is truly remarkable. And let alone just the basic maintenance components of keeping these things flying off the back of ships. And you can imagine salt water and all the ambient conditions that life at sea would bring to an air platform. But the time span, my God, almost 6 decades of constant and continuous operations is truly remarkable.
So thank you, Peter, for bringing this particular item to show here today.
You're very welcome. Most certainly, the Sea King did incredible service throughout its nearly 60-year lifespan. It does have one of the finest safety records of any platform we've ever flown in the Air Force. And just one little item of safety that is this simply almost innocuous-looking bar, but it is an illustration that safety items are emplaced most likely due to an accident or someone finding out that that's not supposed to be done that way or something of that nature. So it's just yet another reminder of how dangerous these things can be, but we always fix the danger, if you could say.
The flight safety item we saw today, the Barker Bar, is an innovation that we see in aircraft operational use, in this case by the Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Canadian Armed Forces in there. Over time, and this is an example of that. Obviously, we aren't seeing the amount of mechanical drawings and effort that it took to get that bar created the way it does, but I'm sure there's a lot more paperwork than actual weight of the item itself today.
Coming up on Militaria.
For an ordinary shovel, it has become a wonderful part of our Royal Canadian Navy history.
The stuff that we did underwater, we couldn't talk about. This we can talk about. My name is Jim Gordon. I spent 36 years in the Navy, retired in '97. Yeah, I brought in a shovel, basic shovel today, but it was a sod turning shovel for the Chiefs and Petty Officers Mess, used in 1959, and it became a trophy among the submariners. It was mostly just interesting to submariners. Now it's gained some interest from others.
First conceived in 1578 by English mathematician William Bourne, submarines were widely implemented in combat at the onset of the First World War. During this period, the Royal Canadian Navy acquired 2 of its own, the CC-1 and CC-2. Active throughout the war effort, these naval vessels fostered a unique subculture among crews that distinguished them from their surface ship counterparts. Years later, during the Cold War, Britain's 6th Submarine Division trained RCN members aboard its subs as they prepared for the 1st Canadian Submarine Squadron, formed in 1966. For 30 years, the unit operated its Oberon-class submarines under the Royal Canadian Navy until they were decommissioned and replaced by the HMCS Victoria class. In 2014, the Canadian Armed Forces celebrated 100 years of submarines in the RCN.
So Jim, this shovel really represents a very unique part of Submariner culture. Can you tell me a bit about the Brotherhood of Submariners and how this shovel fits into that culture?
Commonwealth countries were very tight. There was always a competition, we do it better than you do. We dive deeper than you do. So that competition between navies was wide open. I brought in the shovel. It became a trophy or a challenge through the years. It was put in a cabinet when the new Chiefs and Petty Officers Mess opened up, and the Royal Navy sailors take on anything as a challenge, so they were there the day of the grand opening when they put the shovel in the cabinet, spoke about it, and then that night, over a few wets and looking at the shovel and admiring it, knowing that they were going to sea the next morning and returning back to England, the challenge was on. That's where it started. Many different units and navies became involved, and it would be stolen by the Royal Navy, by the Australians, by the New Zealanders. Even the Australian Wrens got involved. The German air movements people got involved, and the Americans. So it moved around the country. I arrived in Dolphin sometime in 1979, and I didn't even know about the shovel behind the bar. Of course, I did a lot of training in Dolphin, and I was there, and I'd just been promoted to Petty Officer First Class, which gave me privilege to the Chief's Mess. When I got in there, I saw this hung on the bulkhead behind the bar. And right away, they started. They knew I was a colonial, so big smiles. You're here to get the spade? Good luck with that. It was locked up better than the crown jewels, It wasn't a behead anymore. They owned it. Eventually, I had a plan. So when I would go to the mess, I would sit over on one side and I would tuck tools up under the settee. And I got what I thought were the necessary tools. At night when the bar shut, a big steel cage come rolling down and locked into the bar at the bottom. And I had checked it out and there was all these lugs and I thought, well, I'll never get at that. But it was held together with nuts and bolts. And then I had to figure out how to get in there after hours. I decided it was best to break in through a window if I could wind up with one unlocked. And that would mean climbing up on the roof behind, climbing in through a window, and then disassembling the bar. I did that. So in the dark of the night at about midnight, and made my way out with the shovel.
What an amazing piece of history. I mean, an ordinary shovel all of a sudden gained a life and a story and a culture over a series of years. Submariners have a very unique, tight community, and I think that shovel is a wonderful representation of the unity that this group of people do have.
It has become famous now. Since '79 on to when it was retired in the late 90s, everybody wanted a piece of that action to get a tally plate on. And like I said, I put it on the board simply because I expected it was going to have a lot of tally plates on it.
So Jim, what is so unique about this particular artifact is that it started off as a shovel, and just an ordinary shovel broke ground on a new building. It was hung in a mess. But over time, through tradition, through Submariners, it had a new life. As a trophy, as an artifact, it's a unique part of Submariner culture and history. It has been documented on this shovel, so every plaque is a representation of that exchange, of it going back and forth between us and the British and the Australians and the Americans at one point, you were saying. And so I think that's pretty unique. So for an ordinary shovel, it has become a wonderful part of our Royal Canadian Navy history.
The stuff that we did underwater, we couldn't talk about. This we can talk about.
Jim, thank you so much for bringing this artifact in. It really is a unique part of our Canadian naval history. Currently, it is on display at the Naval Museum of Halifax in the submarine room. Why do you think it's important that people see this artifact and know its story?
It was a big part of the Auburn class culture. The culture has changed in the Navy, as many will recognize. They've quieted down. You're not allowed to do certain things like perhaps nick a shovel or break in somewhere. They frown on it now, and they don't have near as much fun as what we had, or we think it's that way anyway. So we wanted to make sure that this part of our culture in Auburn-class submarines was remembered and displayed, and the new era submariners would see it and go raise an eyebrow. Some old submariners out there, we couldn't go to war then. They were too busy stealing shovels. I hope the artifact remains in a prominent place in the museum so that many people will see it over the years. And maybe some of the grandchildren who would come through and say, hey, my granddad told me about that. Don't count it safe at any time. And not just for me, because there's still some old submariners out there. They'll take that museum on as a challenge.
Noted.